Welcome to Decision Point. During its raucous early days, El Paso felt the need to begin churches of all kinds. Bernie and Melissa Sargent, historians extraordinaire, are here to tell us how Protestant churches began here in El Paso. Welcome back again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, good
It's a
to
pleasure.
have you. Yeah, I know El Pasoans know about the missions, and that we at least have some missions here in El Paso, but we've often don't explore the history and how the Protestant churches began here in El Paso. And we have a whole lot of them. I mean, how did they begin? Because you had the missions, and then what?
Well, I think the middle of the early part of the 19th century, you had Protestants, you had the Baptist Methodists. They were all kind of like venturing into this area, and they were trying to set up churches and trying to perhaps get converts, but it wasn't quite successful in the beginning. And then later on, when it seemed it was in the 1870s,
Father Taze.
Thank you. Father Taze arrived in El Paso.
Okay. And who brought him to El Paso?
He was brought by a couple that had moved here from East Texas, and they were here and they longed for their church. They missed the days of the church.
So was this St. Clement's?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was.
right.
Yeah, I was getting there.
Right, yeah, okay, yeah.
Because St. Clement started in their living room.
Oh, okay.
They started to find other people, and it was a very, very small number of people that practiced it. So initially it started off with a few. And finally they brought Father Taze in, and he basically brought the church to what it is today in many ways. He was a very genial, everybody liked him, he was a hard worker, he raised money, he did everything.
So that would have been the Episcopalian church at the time in the early American history, and now so St. Clement's was the first official Protestant church in El Paso, would you say, or?
No, not the very first.
Okay.
Not the very first organized church. There was a number of them that were vying to be the first to have an actual structure dedicated strictly to church services, and you had various different Protestant faiths that did try to achieve that. And in the background, you had the Baptists who were saying, "We can do this too."
It's a little holy competition there.
Right. I remember I was reading on the First Baptist Church. The minister at that time was so disappointed because they didn't have a church yet, and the Methodists had a church, and the Protestants had a church, and everybody else had a church but them.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and he had very few people, so he was having a hard time even getting enough money to build his church.
Right.
But yeah, like I said, the competition was incredible.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that there were actually a lot of churches that began on ranches around. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there was the El Paso community in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, up until it became an actual city, or recognized as a city, as an incorporated town. There were a number of communities around here that made up what we now call El Paso. You had Rancho Concordia, started by Hugh Stevenson, and they, for a number of years, had a larger population than even Franklin or El Paso's beginnings had, and that was considered a rancho, and they had built a small church there which was Catholic, but they built that church because his wife was a very devout Catholic, her family was very devout, and the only way they could go to service was either to go down to the missions or go across the river into Mexico, and that's where their church was. So they built their Alto church there, and we think that that's where she was buried, is right next to it. When she passed away from blood poisoning, she was gored by a pet deer. Oh. And so anyway, Juana was buried there, and that was one of the first churches on a ranch or rancho. But most of the other ranches, they would have church services, but not a formal building dedicated to it. And it was because they had a lot of cowboys or vaqueros that were working the ranches, and quite a few of them had religion.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You wouldn't think so, but that's a good thing. So
I thank God every day I got back to the ranch.
Yeah, right.
Didn't get attacked or run over by a cow. Or
Right. Yeah. Now, what was El Paso like during that time frame? Was it?
It was raucous, as you mentioned.
Did it need religion, so to speak?
Very much so.
Very much so. It was in very bad need because El Paso was considered the little
Monaco.
Monaco.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yes, because of its gambling and sporting business, and it's wonderful women and just all those.
It was
fun
very
things.
colorful
Yes, it was
downtown,
very
yes.
colorful. Yeah, gunfighters, you name it all. It was quite the wild town. It makes Tombstone, when everybody talks about Tombstone, it makes Tombstone look like a sleepy little bird. When
Oh,
you look at
really?
their
Oh, yeah.
long period of time. Several different types of gunfighters came through, and it was on the pass, going east and west, north and south. Again, you're going to get all kinds of people coming through. And they would stay for a while, and they'd build their business, and they'd continue on, or they'd stay here and start businesses.
Making
But
money.
it was wherever the money was at, and this was such a crossing at that time, especially with people heading to California for the gold rush, just for business as a whole. And it was just the wild time. But then you've got the gentiles that come in, the gentle people that want to come in and have their business, their mercantile, the haberdasheries. They had no, they couldn't let their children go out in the daytime for fear of being shot.
Or seeing
Kind of
one-
like
Or
today,
seeing-
you know.
or
Think
seeing
of it, yeah, it's kind of like that.
or perhaps seeing one of the ladies that's not really desirable for
Right.
the young kids to see.
Right.
Oh, yes.
And there was a
yes.
lot of that here because they drew the ne'er-do-wells, and wherever you have those, you have opportunists of different types.
Right.
This place was such a gambling mecca that they would rent the pool tables at night for people to sleep on. There was not enough
wow.
hotel rooms.
There was actually, what, 1 saloon for every 200 El Pasoans.
One for every 27.
One for every 27?
Yeah, one saloon for every 27
Wow.
Yeah.
El Pasoans at the time.
Yeah, that means the average per capita drinking had to be pretty heavy.
It was strong.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was strong.
He was busy.
Our first mayor, Ben Dow, interesting gentleman. He was from Kentucky originally, and his second marriage, his first wife didn't want to move down here, and he had participated in fighting in Mexico for the Americans. He decided this was going to be his home. So his second wife, who was Antigua, she did not want any part of this kind of a crowd. Well, Ben had a place downtown that he had opened up, and he was a bit of a gambler. He brought his racehorses from Kentucky, and he would make a lot of money on the side doing that, as well as being a politician.
Hold races in the streets?
Yeah, races in the streets.
Oh.
Overland Street was a racetrack.
Oh wow.
And so
Right by the county.
Ben's
Yeah.
wife and her family and friends kept putting pressure on him and tell, we can't have that kind of goings on
Yeah.
in this town. And because he had a saloon, she was very upset. So he established the first post office in his saloon. So that kind of pacified it a little bit.
Right.
But the city leaders,
legitimate.
Dual purpose there.
yeah, absolutely. He
right.
was multitasking. But going forward, a lot of the city leaders' spouses said, you know what, we can't raise our children in this environment. If you want to stay here, we have to clean it up.
So once again, women are the civilizing force there, huh?
You can say that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it was maybe both about that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depending on your opinion of civilization.
Right.
Well, also, though, you figure there were no schools here also, and that's where the churches, Parson Tejas ran a school. DeVendel's daughter
Yeah,
was
Mary.
one of his students. Combined children were all Mexicans, and you had Anglos, Mexicans,
Chinese.
Chinese, Jewish. They were all going to school together here.
So that would have been unusual, wouldn't it?
Very unusual.
Yeah,
That's-
in fact, in reading a lot about what took place after the Civil War, El Paso is one of the most neutral communities in the country, and I think today it's still that way.
Still that way in a lot of
Some
ways.
people say that there's a lot of discrimination, but compared to other communities, no, not at all. And it's always been recognized that way. Now, certainly you had undercurrents of things like the Ku Klux Klan and so on, but it didn't last. We always gravitated back to being a more decent community than other communities like ours, especially on a border like we were.
Yeah.
Well, and we're so isolated. I think that was also part of it. We're so far removed from the rest of Texas, New Mexico, and
right.
the other areas that we really had to learn to get along.
Yeah.
And I think that was it. You read excerpts from people coming into town, and they were amazed that they would see somebody with a Mexican coming to their house for dinner, or they'd see him in town talking, just sitting and talking on the benches where they had come from other areas. You
didn't
do that.
mix like that,
No,
huh?
you didn't
Yeah.
mix. He was like, and that continues through this day. I think El Paso is one of the friendliest cities I've ever lived in, and we've lived quite a few
lot of
places.
different places.
You
and
have to
traveled
keep
a lot.
one step ahead of the law, so you've got to move around a lot. That's what we do.
Yeah, and that they did.
Yeah, right.
But as far as the Protestant churches setting up in El Paso, they grew quite quickly. As soon as the railroad came in 1881, there was over half a dozen within a couple of years railroads coming through here, which meant
Half a dozen
a
railroads?
lot of north, south, east,
Different
west.
lines, yeah.
You bet.
Wow.
They were bringing in raw product from the mines in Mexico, the mines in Arizona and New Mexico. They were bringing in lumber, things like that, so that they could build homes, build churches.
Right.
And it grew quickly. And it was a very prosperous community, one of the most in Texas until the early 1930s. We were a very prosperous community.
Now, what impact did the churches have as in the beginning area? Were they successful at creating a more civilized, safe, cultured, stable environment?
Yes, and it brought like-minded people together. When they would worship together in homes or in preaching tents. I love that one. Preaching tents downtown.
Oh, okay.
They would gather, and you get like minds, and so you gather and you've got force now. And you've got your faith that gives you commonality. And from there they grew, and then you started having women's societies, and you had charities, and there were many services that were done for Spanish speaking also, which was unheard of at that time too.
That's interesting.
So the church was going beyond just its doors. It was reaching into the community, creating a better place for people to live. Education, like charities, like I said. What am I missing?
So just quality of life issues, would it be education, culture, civilization, something to do other than go to the saloons?
Well, yeah, exactly. What did you do?
Or go to the saloons after church, some of them.
Yeah,
I mean, think about it. As a woman here, you'd be like, okay, I've done my chores, I've done all my this, I've done that. Now what do I do? Now you get together as a group. You have a safe place you can all get together, and families met, they married.
It really had a huge impact. What were some of who were some of the key people besides Reverend Tays?
What about Baines? Reverend Baines?
Reverend Baines, First Baptist.
There was quite an exciting thing that took place. They were having their first baptism in the Rio Grande.
Yeah. Everybody came down to look.
What was it, like 7 or 8 members of the church? That's all they had? And they had several hundred people on the banks watching?
Yeah, all the other churches closed down their services to go down to watch the baptism in the Rio Grande.
That was the first time that had ever been done?
In the Rio Grande, yes.
So why did they decide to do that in the Rio Grande?
I think it was just something spectacular.
Yeah.
You're baptizing in the river?
Yeah, right.
And it's funny because they talked about the trickling of the river, which is because it was done in February, so you know exactly there was hardly any water in the river at that time, and cold. But I guess it just was kind of like a spectacle. They said it was almost carnivalesque in its atmosphere, the way it was going on. But a lot of the churches did, another thing is they got together. You had Baines, we also had, I'm going completely blank now.
Oh, the other ministers?
Yeah.
Quite a number of different ministers would get involved.
Hiram Reed.
Reed, yeah, Hiram. Well, he was the Jewish from the synagogue.
So a lot of unlike a lot of other places, also the El Paso ministers would work together to be able to.
They did,
because they didn't have their colleagues in their same denomination, so to speak, nearby. So
it wasn't as competitive as other areas of the country that you would have seen in that time period. They worked together a lot. There's rumors that they actually got together and helped build the first synagogue.
That's right. Now, how did that happen? They bring in? They had a Jewish population here, and they wanted to have a synagogue, and the churches helped.
There was quite a migration from the Middle East at that time because of things that were going on over there. And this was a location that was similar in atmosphere, similar in climate to the Middle East.
Definitely.
So they gravitated here, and there was lots of business opportunity.
Sure. So this would be what, the Syrians and Lebanese and
Persians, or Iranians as we would call them today.
Right.
And some from what we now know as Israel.
Sure.
And from that part of the world too.
We also had an influx of the Russians because the Russians were coming to the United States in droves, and they were getting to New York and to Chicago and places like that. And the cities were very overcrowded at that time, and they did not want to raise their families in that kind of environment. Some of the early ones who worked at sweatshops in New York got themselves out of there and came west because everybody else was going west. That's where the opportunity was. And that got them here to El Paso, and some continued on to California or to Arizona. Right. But a lot of them did stay here, the Jewish faith. And hence they had the Mount Sinai, which started off basically as a cemetery, an organization for cemetery, and then they eventually had their first synagogue. Synagogue, yes.
So the churches, the Christian churches helped to build the synagogue.
Yes.
And that's pretty amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, it was unheard of in other parts of the country. They were very segregated, the churches were, but here they weren't. And again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the melding of the different cultures. The Chinese, for instance, they came in here in droves. This was the second most popular place to smuggle Chinese into the United States, second only to San Francisco.
Oh, really? Did they come through Mexico?
They came through Mexico. A lot of them came up to South America as indentured servants. You know, they would have to work their way across the ocean, work their way through South America and then up into Mexico and then on into United States. And so we had a very vibrant Chinese community with their churches. Some were Christian, some were Buddhists.
Right. Right. And so when you look at the establishment of the churches, are a lot of those churches still in existence today?
Quite a few of them.
Yeah.
Quite a few of
Which
them.
would be which ones?
Well, you got, for instance, there was a very famous architect, Henry Trost. He and his brother, and he and his two brothers, had Trost and Trost, and a very, very famous, in that vernacular, architect. And he was responsible.
So were they here in El Paso?
Yes, yes, they were.
Okay.
They came from Chicago and Ohio down here. His
Yeah.
family immigrated into Ohio. He was educated in Chicago. During the same time period that you had people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who's very well known in the
Sure.
architectural world. And one of his professors, one of his mentors, was the same gentleman that designed the World's Fair in Chicago, and also designed very famous train stations around the country, one of which is the station we have here.
Oh.
And that was Daniel Burnham, very famous architect. But anyway, Trost and Trost designed 11 churches, and out of those 11, one was never built, and we had 3 that were demolished, and one that was demolished by fire. And you have one, St. George's Church, which is part of St. Clement's.
Right, yeah.
That's a Trost building.
Okay.
And the exciting thing is it looks as though we're going to be able to see that rehabilitated and then stabilized. We're really excited about
Yeah,
that.
that's wonderful.
Built in 1911, 1912 time frame.
Yeah.
$25,000 is what they paid for that when they built it.
Not anymore?
Not
I was
anymore.
just going to say, it would be nice if we could still pay that much money.
Right, yeah. Now, that started out as a...
Westminster.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and then... So the churches that are left now, are most of them in the downtown El Paso area?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
So that would be St. Clement's, no, not St. Clement's,
Not
St.
St. Clement's.
George's,
First Christian.
First Christian.
You got the Temple Mount Sinai. You
Right.
got Trinity Church. You got the First Presbyterian Church. Those churches. Quite a few of them, almost all of them, are downtown.
Right.
That was the nucleus of the community
Sure.
for quite some time.
Yeah, I don't think we have a concept of how compact El Paso was until fairly recently, actually, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So what was it that was so great about Trost?
He was an
as architect?
experimenter, so to
Yeah.
speak. He, you know, right about the time that he moved here, there was a big hotel downtown that burnt down. And he decided that he was going to come up with a concept of a fairly fireproof construction. It would be concrete reinforced steel. And so he started designing buildings like that. The Mills building was like that, the John Muir building is like that. So most of his buildings were built using that concept because they knew that worst case scenario, you just lose the contents, you wouldn't lose the whole building. And it would allow the people inside a fairly safe evacuation. And so he became very famous for that. Plus, he wasn't tied to one style of design. If you look at his buildings, they're different. All of them are very different. Whereas you look at some of the other architects, and you know,
Well, like you can recognize a Frank Lloyd Wright design.
Yes.
It's pretty unique and pretty, even though, you know, there's a very definite style.
Curry
but
style,
but
yeah.
the Trost, you wouldn't necessarily.
no, you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And he had well over 200 that he designed, his firm designed in the geographic area close by El Paso. Plus there was New Mexico, Arizona, and then you go further south into Texas and you've got Marfa, you've got places down there that have beautiful hotels that were designed by him. And they're used to this day.
Yeah.
The cast for the movie Giant stayed in a very, very, very pretty hotel in Marfa, the Paisano.
Yeah.
Beautiful hotel. And again, that was a Trost design.
Yeah. Well, so why would churches have engaged him, this premier architect?
I think churches, like any kind of building, you want it to stand out and express your feelings. And also, I think they wanted to bring some of what they may have had back east, to the churches there, or even in Europe, brought the stylings and such to, to reflect the religion. And I know there were actually some churches that actually had specialized plans that if you were going to build a church, it had to match that plan that they had. They knew what it cost. It was basically cardboard set up, and you went from there.
Cookie cutter.
Cookie cutter.
Right.
That's probably a better thing to say. I think the Protestant church, the first one, was very much like that because it was a clapboard church.
Well, I was always thinking that like, for example, with St. Clement's, which I know something about the history of, really the size of the congregation at the time that the current building was built, which holds over 500 people, was something like 90 people at the time.
Yeah.
And so is that true of most of the other churches that were built, that it was really a relatively small group of people who had a remarkable vision for what God would do in terms of growing El Paso, growing their congregation? Was that
Well, a good
typical?
example is the First Baptist Church. It started off in a room.
Right, huge
and it
church.
went to a church, which you have a picture of, and then grew to a larger church, and now you see it down on Montana. It's huge.
Yeah, right.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, they started off, I didn't even think they had more than a couple hundred members.
Yeah.
But the church was built to hold, I don't know, 900 people or something like
Yeah.
that. Again, but I think it was the vision and the faith in knowing that if they do this, they will come.
Yeah, right. Build it, they will come. Okay. as they say, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's true of all of them because they all started off very small and then grew very big. And as families grow too, your families are going to grow and they marry and they have children and they're going to stay. They used to stay within those churches too, and so you had to adapt for that.
Yeah, I know. With St. Clement's, we can have 5 generations of families currently attending the church, and I know others have the same situation, which is pretty unusual in this day and age.
Oh yeah,
to have
That
generational attendance. So, who were some of the characters in the early churches? And you always have some of those stories that we might want to know about.
I think usually when you think of a lot of the churches in the early days, you mostly hear of men, but Sister Paraxis at Loretto Academy. She came with the Sisters of Loretto. Actually, the Sisters of Loretto started down in St. Anthony, down in San Elizario, as a school, and then when that grew out, they moved up into El Paso. But she was, if you read about this woman, she was quite the character. Nothing held her down. She built that school to what it is. Again, that's another Trost building, but it grew into such a school of initially it started off for just girls, and a lot of them were coming from Mexico to being educated in the United States. But she did not let anything turn her down. If she needed money, she would go out to the banks. She was unusual. Sisters of Loretto,
at that time.
yes, Sisters of Loretto have always been kind of a
Feisty.
wild card, feisty
right.
group. Yeah, they never take no for an answer, and they still don't to this day. And she just went out and worked with the community. Just was able to communicate so much better than many of the other nuns. They didn't know how to work with the communities. They've been pretty much with inside, and she built what you see today, the Academy of Loretto.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's attributed to her. And how about some of the other characters? Were there people whose lives were changed and they became part of the church?
There's one by the name of John Wesley Harden.
Ah, yes.
There you go. Yeah.
Actually,
By the name like John Wesley.
Right, yeah.
His name, the namesake.
Right.
He was raised initially by a father who was a minister in East Texas, and that was he was kind of the byproduct of the Civil War, and ended up going the wrong way as far as lifestyles go.
Yeah.
Well, while he was in prison, he became an ordained minister. Now, I can't say he went in there wanting to do that, but when he realized he wasn't going to get out and he had 25 years to serve, he turned to religion. And became very adept at preaching to these people in prison. Now, you wouldn't think of that knowing how his demise came about, but
and his history of being
his
a
history
gunfighter.
of being a
yeah.
gunfighter.
Yeah, he was a gunfighter, yeah.
Very much so, yeah. One of the most notorious, perhaps the most notorious gunfighter of that period of time. And when he came out, he was not only a minister, but I think where he went wrong is he also became a lawyer.
Oh,
yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah.
Oil and water.
Oil and water, yeah. So he came to El Paso, and I think people were looking to him perhaps as turning his life around. But then he found alcohol and a young lady named Beulah Morose, and that just stopped that whole thing.
So he was on the right track for a while, and then made a lot of converts and so forth, and then
In prison, but I guess the jury is out. We really don't know whether he did the converts because he wanted to get out early or because he really believed in the Word.
yeah,
But he did preach.
yeah.
He did preach in prison.
Well, God can use all kinds of people in all kinds of situations.
Yeah,
Right.
it's amazing that
Yeah,
way.
right. Well, it's remarkable again how El Paso is a unique place from the standpoint of the spiritual roots, the spiritual heritage, and at the same time, all of this wild and crazy stuff going on. But yet, you had a strong church that was growing, people of faith who wanted to make a difference and make the community a better place. And so we have El Paso today, which
Yeah.
is a strong faith community
Still,
still.
yeah.
And it was a very big stop on the circuit.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have the tents come through
Sure.
quite often.
The preachers
That's
and
right.
evangelists.
And there was one that stayed here, I believe, 7 days. He had a service that lasted 7 straight days. No breaks,
oh, wow.
if you can imagine. Well,
That
except
wouldn't
for...
sell very well these days. but-
The Protestants were one that had tents.
Yeah.
They had tents, the preaching tents.
Right, yeah. So it became, with a lot of traveling evangelists coming through and so forth, and that of course helped the cause as well. Well, it's been a delight to
you.
speak with you,
Thank you.
and I'm sorry, but we're out of time, but we'll continue the discussion. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Yeah, good. So do you think that El Paso should preserve all of these architectural gems that we have from the Trost and Trost architects? And what do you think about the beginnings of the Protestant church in El Paso? We'd love to know. Please tell us on Facebook, Twitter, or our website. Thank you so much for watching.